All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today in our What's Your Science Message webinar. So before we get started, we want to talk a little bit about our program in AGU. So AGU is the American Geophysical Union, and specifically within that, we are part of the Sharing Science program. And our goal is to provide fellow scientists with the tools, skills, resources that they need to communicate their science, their research, their message to any audience. And we do this through a number of ways. So obviously webinars, you all are here today, but we also do workshops at our annual meeting and at institutions, organizations, universities. We try to provide outreach opportunities for folks where they are, if possible. We provide hands-on support. So if you have a problem, if you are talking to, say, a member of the press and want some pointers, we are always happy to help with that. And recently, a few weeks ago actually, we started a Twitter account. We're at AGU_SciComm. So if you're on Twitter, we're always posting not only stuff from AGU and from our program, but general, say, popular science pieces, or the science behind science communication, or suggesting other science communication folks to follow. So we're really active on that as well. So we try to provide whatever help we can through a number of ways. So who are we? So this is who you'll be hearing from today. I'm Shane Hanlon. I'm in the Sharing Science program proper. We also have Olivia Ambrosio, who's also part of the Sharing Science program proper. And then the great thing about Sharing Science is we also pull in some folks from different departments here at AGU. So we're also going to have Lauren Lafuma from our Public Information Office, and that's really our press office, the folks who work with journalists in the media. And then we also have Carissa Bungie, who's from our Public Affairs Office, and they are our Government Relations Legislative Affairs shop. And so briefly, what are our goals today? So we're going to talk very quickly about how to identify the audience that you want, and then really get into the messaging part. So some communication basics on how to keep things simple and interesting. The really core of it is going to be message development. How do you develop your message? How do you craft your message? And then so maybe some follow-up at the end on practicing. You want to make sure that you practice speaking and also listening when thinking about your audience and your message.
So hi, this is Olivia Ambrosio. And before you start developing your message, you really want to think about your audience, because how you structure your message is going to depend on who your audience is. And often you'll have the opportunity to choose your audience if you're interested in reaching out to people to share your science. So one audience that we talk about a lot is the public and sharing science with the public. And that's a great goal, but we all have to acknowledge that the public is not a single homogeneous entity. Right? It consists of a vast collection of people with disparate ages, interests, and concerns. And depending on the context, all of us are also part of the public. So if you're thinking about sharing your science with the general public, which is great, consider reaching out to a specific community group or other local group, because at least then you'll know that the people involved share a common set of interests or values, or even have a shared mission. And there might be some groups that you've already thought about before that seem natural for communicating science, like nature centers or science museums. But depending on what kind of science you want to talk about, there are a lot of other audiences that might be really interested in your message too, from chambers of commerce, if your research has an economic angle, to senior centers or retirement communities where the members might be really engaged and might also be much more receptive and have the time to respond to a call to action. And Carissa is going to talk a bit about policymaker audience.
Hi, everyone. So whether you are hoping to speak to a local policymaker or a federal policymaker, there are certain things that you definitely want to make sure you keep in mind when you are trying to speak to these audiences. So something that we always recommend is to make sure that you do your research. Some really great things to look into include maybe the prior profession of your policymaker, whether they were a teacher or a scientist or a lawyer. Understanding their background will help you shape your message and make sure that you can connect with them. Another thing to look into is what committees they sit on. This will also give you a really great indication of what their priorities are and what issues they care about. And the same thing goes for caucuses. So whatever caucuses your member of Congress or your local policymaker is on will give you a good indication of what they care about and what their interests are. And then in addition to that, we would recommend looking into any sort of legislation they've introduced or sponsored or co-sponsored. Again, this gives you an idea of what their priorities are and what they might be for or what they might be against. Another thing to consider is their constituency. You are probably one of those constituents. So it's important to keep in mind what the people who voted them into office care about, because that's what they're going to care about. And then finally, something to keep in mind is that you will likely be interacting with their staff. So just kind of remember that there are going to be multiple people you interact with. It won't just be your policymaker.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Lauren. So I'm going to talk to you guys briefly about working with the media. So there will really be two main interactions that you'll have when working with reporters. The first is when either you're contacted or you contact the media directly about a new research finding that could be published in a new study or presented at a scientific meeting. And this is where the reporter will want to interview you as a scientist about the new science that's coming out and what it means. The other main interaction you'll have with the media is when you make yourself available as a resource. And this really involves kind of being an expert for a reporter. So for example, if a reporter is writing a story about landslides and they really don't have a background in that area, and you're a landslide expert, maybe they would call you up to get some background information. Or, for example, if a landslide happens or another kind of natural disaster, such as an earthquake or a volcano, then they can call you directly for an analysis of that particular event. So today we don't really have time to go into what it means when you make yourself available as an expert, but there are more resources on the AGU website, which you can get to through this link at the bottom. So today I'm going to focus on talking about what happens when you're talking about new research findings, which we'll get into in just a little bit.
All right, and so just as a reminder, everyone, Lauren had that link up. We will have this webinar archived later, so there are a lot of links in this, but don't worry, you'll have access to that. So we briefly went over identifying your audience, but the bulk of what we're going to talk about today is once you know who you want to talk to, how do you draft your message? And so I guess the first question is, what is a message? What's the main points of it? So this is really a distillation of your key points. You want to distill and disseminate and really get what you want to talk about to your audience. And so there's a whole number of ways to do this. A really great tool that was actually kind of pioneered by the Science Communication Organization Compass is a message box. This is one tool that a lot of people really like. We use this as well. So basically, you have your primary issue and then the questions around it. So what's the problems? So what? Why do people care? Potential solutions and benefits. And then we have here one example that, again, the webinar will be archived. So you can reference this later to see how your question, your issue, your research would fit into this model. Some general tips. So you want to make sure to keep things relevant to the audience at hand. So if you're talking to, well, really anyone, and you say something like the levels of soil moisture in our area have decreased by X amount in the past 3 years. Well, they'll probably get that, but is that really relevant to them? Would it be better to say drought in our area has intensified, putting more pressure on our already stressed water resources and increasing threats of wildfire? Yes, in that previous statement, you said what the problem is, but this way it makes things relevant. These are folks that are worried about their water, they're worried about crops, they're worried about economy, they're worried about their safety. Using metaphors is a really great way to get your message across, especially when you're talking about complex or really technical issues. So, for example, sharing spectrum would make the data transfer from satellites such as GOES-R harder to interpret. Spectrum is kind of this bandwidth of information we have going to and from satellites. So again, yes, this is a factual statement, but maybe if you use the metaphor like, well, imagine looking at a map through blinds. This is what data from satellites look like if we have to share spectrum. And so you can visualize that. You can actually have this picture in your head, and if you're visualizing it, your audience is going to be visualizing it as well and probably retaining a little bit more. You want to make sure to give examples related to people's own lives. You've already identified your audience, so you probably know at least a little bit about them, so you can use examples to make it relevant to them. Again, going back to relevancy. So, for example, if you say something like, we're seeing an increase in abundance in invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay, maybe something like, well, when whatever species invades the bay, they push out blue crabs, for example, which provide X amount of dollars for Maryland and Delaware economies each year. So you're giving an example of what the species is, and you're giving an example of why it matters to your audience, why it would matter for the economy. And you want to make sure that you emphasize the value of science in your work. So saying something like, I study coronal mass ejections and space weather. Those are facts. Those might not be facts that really are valuable to people or that people can really relate to. Maybe you might want to say, the research that I and others do on conditions on the sun helps predict and prepare for disruption or damage to our power grid, weather or other satellites, and infrastructure. Emphasizing these things that people really care about, that people value, that's what's going to be what really resonates with them. And no matter what, and we really stress this one, end on a positive note and how science can be part of a solution. So if you're asking people to recycle while screaming that the world's going to end soon, that's not going to resonate with them. They're just going to say, well, why? You want to make sure you end on a positive note. Say, we have this opportunity to safeguard our quality of life and make sure that our communities, health, resources, and environment are enjoyed by generations to come. We understand that science on its basis might not always be incredibly uplifting. However, it does help to have a positive message because that's what people are going to remember, and that's what's really going to affect them and matter to them. And so we have, this is just a couple of them, but we have a ton of additional resources, different types of toolkits and handouts and things that we've created to help folks with jargon or messaging or tips, just general tips on communicating. You can find all of this stuff on our website. And now we're going to talk specifically about messaging for media.
All right. So I'm going to talk to you guys about how, working with the media is a little bit different than maybe a general public audience. So first, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background about how reporters and members of the media share science with their readers. So, and I'm going to talk to you about news style, which means the way that a news story is structured, and that is called the inverted pyramid. So if you look at the pyramid on the left, this is a typical way that a scientific paper or a research presentation is structured. You start off with your introduction and the background, talking about the previous research that's been done. Then you move into the methods and the description of the particular study that's being described. Then you go into the results, the discussion, and the conclusions, what you found and what that means. News stories are actually written the complete opposite way, where the results and conclusions are front-loaded at the beginning of the story, and then the implications are discussed, and then finally you get to the research details and methods. There's actually two reasons that news stories are written this way, even though it seems kind of counterintuitive. The first reason is very simple. It's that people don't really have very long attention spans anymore. So you have to give them the most important information first to make sure that they get it. The second reason is kind of old school, and that's back in the days of print. when news articles were literally laid out on a physical page. If a story was too long, an editor would literally take a pair of scissors and cut off the bottom of an article to make it fit. Now, if you write a news story the way a scientific presentation is written, and you have to cut off the bottom of it, you literally cut off the most important part, which is the results, the discussion, and the conclusion. But if you write a story in the inverted pyramid, you still have those parts, but you cut off some of the details and methods. So the audience still gets a general sense of what the story is about. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is not so that when you're in an interview with a reporter, you present your results and conclusions first. No, you can present them in whatever order you want. But I'm telling you this to show you that the most important things that news stories focus on are the results and the conclusions and the implications of a scientific study, rather than the details and the really nitty-gritty technical issues. All right. So keeping all that in mind, when you're creating a message for the media, and it's a really good idea to, if you know you have an interview coming up with a reporter, it's a really good idea to prepare this in advance. So you want to break your message down into 3 points. The first is what we know, then what is new, and why it matters. And with the media, it's also even extra important to make sure that you're very clear with your messaging in each of these 3 points. And the reason is because the media, the reporter, is the middleman between you and the person who's going to ultimately read the story. So because there's that extra step, there's an opportunity for the message to be distorted or even possibly lost. So you want to make sure that the message you're giving to the reporter is clear and there's no ambiguity whatsoever. So what do I mean by each of these 3 things? Well, what we know, that means the context and the background. Why are you doing this study in the first place? Why does it matter? It also gives the reader a frame of reference. So if you say, well, I study the Pine Island Glacier in Antarctica, that doesn't mean a whole lot to someone who's not in the field of glaciology. But if you say, I study the Pine Island Glacier, which is the fastest melting glacier in Antarctica, well, that gives it a little more reference, a little more context. The next part is what is new, and this is simply the new scientific finding that's presented in the study or in the research presentation. So you want to discuss what's new and also compare it to what was known before, and also to what other scientists are doing currently. If there's probably many people studying the Pine Island Glacier in Antarctica, so how does your study differ from their studies and what they found? In this part, you also want to mention how your result compares to the current consensus. Is your study unusual? Is your result counterintuitive? Does it go against the current consensus, or is it with the current consensus? Those are important distinctions to make to the reporter. The third part, and perhaps the most important, is why it matters. So this is the impact on society and on people's lives. You should really be able to literally answer the question, why should I care? And I don't just mean why should a scientist care, why should a reporter care, why should any, Joe Sixpack off the street, why should that person care about the finding of your study? This is the impact on people's lives. And with that comes the human dimension. Literally, that just means, how does this affect people? The other part of that is, how it affects you. What is the emotional connection here? What was your journey like as a scientist going through this study and conducting this research? All of these things are really important to convey in your science message. So to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about, here's a press release that we did last year here at HEU. And this was about a study that came out that found ocean acidification is affecting coral reefs in the Florida Keys, and found that the reefs are dissolving due to the low pH of the water. So if we break down the message for this study into the 3 parts, what we knew already was that the oceans are absorbing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That lowers the pH of seawater. Lower pH can then dissolve coral reefs. Scientists expected that the pH would be low enough to dissolve coral reefs in Florida around the middle of the century. But what was found in this study is that coral reefs in the Florida Keys are already dissolving because of the low seawater pH. And so now this is happening 40 to 50 years earlier than was expected. So why it matters. And while this may seem obvious to a scientist, it may not seem obvious to the reader. And you really want to make a connection, follow the thread from your result all the way to the effect on someone's life. So here, this example would be, we know that coral reefs are being affected. That means that other ocean ecosystems are probably being affected by ocean acidification as well. That means the ocean could be unhealthy, and our lives are completely dependent on the ocean. What you don't want to do here is just say, well, the ocean's important. That doesn't really mean anything. So you really want to connect it to people's lives. Say, look, we depend on the ocean for the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. If the ocean is unhealthy, so are we. That is the connection you really want to make. So the last part of last part of preparing your message is your take-home message. And so what you want to do is take those three parts, what we know, what's new, and why it matters, and distill it down into your take-home message, which is 2 or 3 main points that is what you want the reader to take away from the study, it's what you want them to remember. And it also includes what you want them to do about it. So going back to that same example, the researcher in this study boiled his research down into these 2 points here. We don't have as much time as we thought. The reefs are already beginning to dissolve away. That's what he wants the reader to take away from this. We don't have as much time as we thought before. And then the second part is, this is one more reason why we need to get serious about reducing carbon dioxide emissions sooner rather than later. That's the part of what he wants the reader to do about it. It's very clear that he wants these readers to get serious about reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So if you guys have any more questions, we have lots of resources on the Sharing Science website on talking to the media, and then we can take questions at the end. And now Chris is going to talk about messaging to policymakers.
Okay. So I'm going to take some time now to talk to you about how to message your science for policymakers. So one of the most important things to keep in mind when creating your messaging for this group is what we like to refer to as the ask. So the ask is DC lingo for the purpose of your visit. And while you would probably never knock on your neighbor's door and ask that they mow your lawn, requests are normal and expected at congressional meetings. After all, you are their constituent, and theoretically, they're in office to serve your interests. So having an ask will also help you to structure your message to a policymaker. The story you tell will largely revolve around and support your ask. So generally, when you're meeting with policymakers, you'll have 2 different types of asks. The first is about a policy issue. So it could be something broad, like please support funding for the Earth and Space Sciences. Or it could be something more specific, like vote against HR 2228 that would prohibit all public schools from teaching about evolution. And generally speaking, the more specific your ask, the better. For example, please increase funding for NSF, which funds Earth and Space Science. You want your ask to be something the policymaker can act on. The second type of ask is the relationship ask. This is about building a long-term relationship with the office. So you can ask the policymaker or the staffer, how can I be a resource to you? And this is especially important for those of you who might work for an agency and who may not be able to make a policy ask or an ask for funding. But you can offer to be a resource to the office by answering their questions, providing district-specific information, or updates on what your agency is doing, and just make sure that they can rely on you for unbiased scientific facts on an issue. So now let's talk about how you would want to create your message for a meeting with a policymaker or their staff. It's important to decide how you will make your meeting stand out and how to make it memorable. To achieve this, there are a few areas that are good ideas to highlight in your meetings, and this is where your homework comes in that I mentioned earlier. So, like a resume, your message to a member of Congress or local policymaker should not be generic. You want to get as specific as possible to the member and their interests. Because you're the person who is requesting something from them, it's your job to clearly demonstrate the connection between the policymaker and what it is you're discussing. So one of the best ways to make this connection is making your message local. You can start by discussing the impacts that your science or your program has had on the district or state. So for example, did your program recently discover something? Have you been recognized or awarded recently? Does your university stimulate your area's economy or bring in constituents? Another really great way to connect with an office is connect to a value that the policymaker cares about. So this might be something like sustainable agriculture, national security, a strong economy, or public health. Depending on your science, this might be obvious or a little trickier to connect the dots. So for example, if you're a planetary scientist, you might be scratching your head right now. But if your member of Congress is passionate about something like STEM education, then you could discuss how excitement about going to Mars or finding exoplanets gets kids interested in STEM and makes them more likely to eventually pursue a STEM career. And this is much like a broader impact section of a grant proposal and provides guidance for why your research and message should be of concern to the office. And remember, what might seem like an obvious connection between your research and things like the economy or national security might not be so obvious for someone unfamiliar with your science. So once you've covered the importance of your science and its applications, you should discuss the more human story behind your science. The more personal you can make your research, the better. Generally, people are less likely to remember detailed facts and much more likely to remember a story about why science can help keep their constituents safe, for example. You could speak about how your program brought you to the area, why you chose your program specifically, or how you became interested in your science and what encouraged you to pursue it. Any specific anecdotal stories you know about people who've benefited from science directly are always great to share in meetings. Asking you questions. For example, you could ask them how you can help them or if they've heard of your program before. So ideally, the staffer would speak about 50% of the time. Not only is this a time for you to educate the office and policymaker on your work, but also a time for you to learn about what their views are and how you can help them. So this is a helpful message box that we like to use when meeting with lawmakers. It's helpful to think within these avenues when crafting your message. So, for example, if you're a scientist that studies hurricanes, you might want to build your message around the idea that your science helps to save lives, and you might have a personal story about why you got involved in that area of science. You may have grown up in a family or community that was affected by a historic hurricane, and they still talk about it to this day. So you'd want to use that story in your message. If you build your message around relevance, think about how your science will matter to the office you're speaking to. When speaking to a member from a coastal southern state, you might mention that local communities are now incorporating your prediction models into an app that their constituents can access. To a member on, say, the banking committee, you might talk about how the advances in hurricane prediction, which you have contributed to, have helped the insurance industry more accurately insure houses. And again, for all policymakers, you want to make sure you have a call to action in your message. For example, to ensure that we continue to make advances in hurricane sciences, I ask that you increase funding for NOAA. Or to ensure these storms don't change another generation, I ask that you invest in resiliency programs. So now we're going to shift into discussing controversial topics. Something that you might run into when communicating with policymakers or really any audience is addressing controversial topics. So what if you're speaking to an audience that might not share your views about science in general or about the particular topic you're discussing? How do you approach that? One good piece of news is that in many ways the approach is the same. It's about understanding the listener and finding out how to connect with them. What are their values and interests? Which of those values and interests do you share, and how can you build a connection around them? How can you shape your talk to build off of those themes? So the difference with these types of skeptical audiences is that, one, you'll have to work a little bit harder to understand and connect to their frame of reference. And two, you might have to come at your science in a slightly more nuanced way than you might otherwise. So a great example of this is how lawmakers talk about climate change. Climate change, as you know, has become a politicized issue in Washington, D.C. and across the nation, and it's become a pressing science issue. As a result, there are some great examples of how to discuss things like climate science with a potentially skeptical audience. So a great example of this, someone who you may have heard of before, is Katharine Hayhoe. And I'm going to try to share a video of a talk she gave at a TED conference about climate change.
We're known for a lot of things here in West Texas. One of the things we're very well known for is our fields of white cotton and the friendly farmers in them. We don't just grow cotton, we also raise cows. And we're very well known for what we do with those cows. And of course, no talk at Texas Tech would be complete without mentioning something else we are very well known for here in West Texas, and that is our world-class football. But there is something that we are not so well known for here in West Texas, and it's something we've seen a lot of lately. And I have to admit, when I was scraping the snow and ice off my car, I was tempted to think, where's global warming now? I'd like a little of that, please. This is not what our winters should look like. So here we are, talking about what if, though? What if this global warming thing is real? What?
So we really like to use this as an example because when talking about climate science to an audience in Texas, Catherine Ayo knows that she first needs to establish their shared values and interests. So she references things that Texas is known for, like barbecue and football. And so once she's able to establish that shared connection, she can pivot to something like climate science and climate change. And it makes it much more likely that her message will be heard because her audience already has a connection with her. There we go. So another tip for preparing to speak about controversial topics is to make sure that you do your homework. So be sure to prepare your main messages in advance. Sticking to your points is important for maintaining clarity. Also, try to anticipate what might be contentious. What are potential rebuttals your audience might have? Make sure you have a succinct response without getting too far into the weeds. And also, try to avoid negative statements about other researchers and their work. The last thing you want is to look biased, and sharing these types of comments could damage your credibility. We've all been to talks where someone asks a provocative question and bad moderators or panelists might go down the rabbit hole and engage the audience member. A good moderator or speaker will address the question in a way that bridges back to the topic at hand or the point they were trying to make. So you want to take this same approach if you're faced with an audience member who attempts at instigating an argument. So answer questions in a way that is accurate but bridges back to your main points. And it's especially helpful if you have transition statements ready to go to get back to your messages. So some examples might be something like, I see where you're going with that question, but what's really important here is blank. Or that's not my particular field of expertise, but what I can tell you is blank. So having those transition statements ready is really helpful in avoiding those types of arguments. And finally, whether it's building a relationship with your community group, a reporter, or a policymaker, it's going to take time for you to build trust with people. So when your audience is skeptical or might not be receptive to your message, try to take a step back and remember why you're really there, which is to share your science and build a relationship. An audience that you alienate is not going to be receptive to your message, no matter how many facts and data you present them with. And now I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to talk about what we have coming up next.
Yeah, so thank you all for attending so far. We've tried to give you a whirlwind tour of some messaging tips and guidelines, and I hope that it's inspired you not only to develop your message, but also encourage you to actually go out and use them if you haven't done so already, or even if you have. And I hope that you'll also continue to engage with us in the Sharing Science program and use all of AGU's resources that can support you in science communication. For example, next week, the Public Affairs Department at AGU is offering a U.S. budget webinar. So this is all about the U.S. budget process, which is really critical for science funding and the U.S. scientific enterprise, and it can have repercussions for science around the world. So I do encourage you to listen to that as well. And we'll also be offering a lot more science communication and outreach focused webinars throughout the year, including one exclusively on working with the media, as well as some on storytelling, video development, and more. So you can keep an eye out for those through our Sharing Science web pages, or again, follow us on Twitter, as Shane was mentioning earlier. And if you're an AGU member, I encourage you to join the Sharing Science Network. So we ask you to fill out a very brief profile, and what that lets us know is not only what kind of science you do, but what sort of outreach you've done and what kinds you're interested in, so that we can reach out to you with specific opportunities that are relevant to what you're doing and what you're interested in. You'll also get a snazzy newsletter like this one once a month that will highlight upcoming opportunities to engage in outreach. It'll mention all kinds of skills building opportunities that we and others offer, and it'll also talk about the science of science communication and give you examples of really effective science communication to inspire you. So again, do check out the website in the events area to find out more of what's coming up in Sharing Science. And you can get more information through a variety of our websites, our Twitter accounts, our blog, The Plainspoken Scientist, or The Bridge, which is on science communication and on policy and science, respectively. And again, this will be archived if you want any of these links. And so we'll be happy to take questions. What I will ask that you do is please keep your lines muted, ask questions in the chat box, and what you can do, what would be easiest for us, is you'll see when you have your little chat window open, you have a choice in the right below the window of send chat to staff. If you can do that, rather than just sending it to the whole group, that would be really helpful for us. So we'll be happy to start taking some questions. I see we have some already. One that we have is regarding what Lauren was talking about with the media in terms of how you want to talk about what you would like readers to do about something. This questioner says, this gets into stealth advocacy, is the phrase that they use. If we are not transparent about this advocacy up front, we risk losing credibility. Personally and broadly among the scientific community, how do you suggest we navigate this? So I'll just say a couple of things on this, and I'll let Lauren also address it briefly. Everyone is going to have to make their own choices about what or how much they want to say in terms of what they want people to do about the findings that they've made. So it will depend on your personal preference as to how much you want to say. And you can be very upfront about that and talk about what you personally feel is the best approach based on what you know about science and what matters to you. I will say that within the scientific community is one thing, but I will say that there's been some recent research, and I'm sorry I can't remember the journal, maybe we'll get back to you on that, that for the public, the degree of perceived quote-unquote advocacy that a scientist engages in related to their science, in other words, what sort of policies they're supporting or not, does not affect the credibility of the scientist. This was at least in this study related to climate science. And I'll let Lauren address this briefly before we get on to another question.
Yeah, I agree with everything Olivia said. I would just add that, sometimes there may not be something that you want the reader to do. For example, the exoplanets, example that Carissa gave. Yeah, if you've just discovered a new exoplanet, well, there really isn't a whole lot that a person can do about that. There isn't really a call to action there. It could just be you want them, you're sharing your science and you want to inspire an excitement in them. So if you really feel there isn't a call to action, that's okay. You still want to develop your take-home message, which is what do you want them to take away from this? Which in that example could just be, like the wonder of the universe and the fact that, there could be many other planets besides Earth that are just like ours. And but if you do feel that there is a call to action, so in that example I gave earlier about ocean acidification and coral reefs, well, the science, I would say, lay out a couple examples of a way that people can get involved. For example, perhaps they can go and lobby their policymakers about having stricter CO2 emissions regulations, things like that. Perhaps they can get involved with local ocean conservation groups. So you never want to say, you should do this, but give them examples of how they could get involved, and and what would be the ideal thing. So if you were going to do something about this, what could you do, and kind of like what the end goal is. So again, with that ocean acidification example, the take-home message from that was, or the call to action was, we need to get serious about reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So that is the end goal. That's the thing you want. That's kind of the high-level thing you want to think about. But you can also then give them several ways that they could do that. Again, as I mentioned, being involved, advocating for stricter emissions regulations, and getting involved in policy and advocacy. Hope that answers your question.
Another one we had was someone said that we were giving a lot of kind of 20-word sentences in our answers rather than maybe, say, active verb 10-word sentences. So this whole idea of brevity is probably best when you're trying to come up with your message. And generally speaking, it's really, we do say we like to distill and disseminate. And you don't want to be incredibly wordy and mainly overly technical. And you want to avoid jargon. We didn't really talk about that in here, but when we do when we do kind of like longer things, when we do our workshops, we spend a significant amount of time on jargon. These are excessive acronyms in general, really technical terms, words with multiple meanings. You might have seen none of those worksheets we put up. So we do believe that there is a value in being brief, especially depending on who your audience is. So if you're talking to a community group, say a wilderness group, and you have a little bit more of a time, you have a little bit more time if you're doing, say, a research or a presentation on your work, or you're letting them tour your lab or your field site or something, versus if you're talking to a congressional member, you might have to say what you do while talking to them between meetings. You may have 30 seconds. And so if you, again, this is on our site, but I mean, you've probably all heard of the elevator pitch. So it's good to have a message in many different forms. Your message might not always be shorter. If you take this really technical information and you try and put it into, say, plain spoken English, the kind of default is that, yes, it should be shorter, but it might not be shorter as long as it's clearer. But it probably is best to have different versions, say your true elevator pitch, which what do you do in 10 seconds in 2 sentences? And then maybe you have a little bit more time. Maybe you have, say, a 5-minute response, maybe an interaction with someone on the subway. And then if someone asks you in pleasant conversation, or then if you're going to a community group, if you're going to be on the Hill. So I would say that, yes, the examples we use may have been a little bit longer, but there's a best way to do it depending on who your audience is. And that's why we lead with audience. Knowing who your audience is, knowing how much time you have is really important, and then you can craft your message from there.
So we have a question now about how to talk about science that doesn't necessarily have an effect on Earth yet, the sort of science for science's sake question. And Carissa is going to talk a little bit about good ways to discuss that.
So we come across this question a lot, especially when AGU has meetings here in DC. Something that we like to talk about is the whole idea of what I mentioned before of students getting interested in STEM and kind of creating that interest in science and math that our country needs to do X, Y, Z. Something that we reference is kind of this science pipeline, of you started as a student in high school and you took a physics class that you loved, and then you ended up doing research on exoplanets, and then you went and worked for an agency or a private, industry partner. So kind of just telling that whole story of where your research fits in to the broader kind of pipeline of science is always a really great idea. Another thing that you might want to talk about is maybe if you have grad students, if you run a lab or something and you're able to fund grad students, kind of talking about how you're opening the door for younger scientists to kind of be involved in that science pipeline. Those are all great things to bring up where there's not a direct implication for your research on this planet.
Okay, great. So this is Lauren again. So we have another question about working with the media. This question was about, do we have any recommendations related to print versus TV and radio interviews? So for a TV and radio interview that is not done live, it's pretty much the same as doing an interview for a print piece. But if you are in a situation where you're doing a live interview on TV or radio, yeah, that's a little bit different. It's a little bit scary. The recommendations I would have, in addition to what we've already said, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. So sometimes you normally won't be able to see a reporter's questions ahead of time, but in the case that you do, try to prepare answers. And so think about, create your message, whether or not you can see the questions ahead of time, create the message that you want to send to the listener or the viewer. Prepare this in advance and go over it many times. Also think about and to try to anticipate what questions the reporter might have, what follow-up questions, what might be contentious about your message. So for example, let's see, so you want to think about, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So you want to prepare ahead of time, rehearse, try to write down ahead of time what your main points are, what your main message is, and rehearse it. Think about really good metaphors and anecdotes and stories that you can include in your interview. Those are very helpful.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we had another question. How do you talk about future risk? I'm assuming that this is situations, say, with climate change or other issues where we're talking about a certain level of uncertainty or a certain level of increased risk in the future versus right now, so it doesn't necessarily have the same immediacy. So that's what I'm going to assume this is about. This can be tricky. You know, with anything where you're talking about risk, I would say, you know, I think the insurance people and the insurance analogies are pretty great. You know, you don't anticipate that your house is going to be destroyed in a fire, but you have home insurance anyway. You know, when you're talking about these risks where the damage could be very serious, even if the likelihood is pretty low, when you put it in terms that have to do with insurance, I think it helps people see how they're already working the probabilities and understanding probabilities in their everyday lives. And that's a useful way to connect it for them. That seems to be all of the questions that we have at the moment. We'll wait another minute in case anyone is typing. Some people type more slowly because they don't want to have typos. I will admit that I have written many things wrong this past few days, like drawing ring. So, you know, feel free to type more slowly if you'd like.
And something I'll just add, so if you can't think of anything or you don't think of anything right now, that's fine. Like I said at the beginning, that we are here to help all the time. So if you follow us on Twitter, you can tweet at us. You can send us an email at sharingscience@agu.org. We are always to help with super big issues. If you're you're going to meet with your member of Congress, you're being interviewed by a member of the press, if you're giving a community talk, or if you just have a question on maybe how to phrase something or want some sort of be plain spoken abstract or something. We're here to help at any time. So again, if you can't think of anything right now, that's fine. The webinar will be archived and you can always come back to us later.
So yes, in response to this last question, the webinar is being recorded and we'll have it archived through the Sharing Science web pages. And you know, if you ever need the link, you can contact us about it. So it will be available in the future as well. Okay.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I thought of something else for the extra planets around stars. Another thing that you might want to talk about if you were having a meeting with a policymaker is kind of talking about if your institution is discovering something, you know, and this kind of touches on what Lauren said. If you're discovering something new, policymakers, local or federal, love to be able to like brag about the things that are happening in their district and state. And so if you can bring that kind of sense of pride into the office, that's another way that you could connect that, or any signs really that might seem a little more obscure.
Okay. Well, as we don't seem to have more questions, thank you all very much for attending. And again, please, if you're members and you're not yet members of the Sharing Science Network, please do become ones, and just keep an eye out on the AGU pages and the Sharing Science pages for more opportunities like this. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.